Okay, so here is a tutorial on cleaning up our 3D campus models. These are what we consider low poly models. They're one piece of geometry for each building and one texture. You guys don't have the textures, but I can provide those if you need them. Here's a quick way to check. You always want to make sure what units you're working in. So if you go to Customize Units, there's how it's displayed in all the dialogues, and then there is system unit setup, which should be 1 unit equals a foot. If it's not, you need to switch it and make sure things are to scale. We can compare that with the AutoCAD file that I got from you guys. This one is, I think, in inches, so you need to be careful when you go back and forth all the way to Rhino. So this is an import of the DWG. This is the 3D model of campus that I provided. I think this is the CAD scaled up by 12. Not too sure why. This is actually in real units. That's about the right distance for the front face of the East Architecture building. So what we'll do is quickly scale this down as a reference. So I'm going to just type in SEL mesh, and that'll select all my mesh objects. Just make sure I didn't have something selected before, which I did, and then I can invert that selection, and that'll give me all the line work. But as you can see, it didn't select everything because it locked layers. And I might as well go ahead and type, or turn all the objects on and type show just to make sure nothing's hidden. So I'll try to select the mesh again, invert. And then scale. And I'm just going to guess that this is 12, which is 0.083. I'm going to go ahead and set a reference point just here as a corner on that vertex. And since we are working with meshes, you will have to snap to using vertex down here as your snap to be able to do any movements on that mesh. Endpoint I don't think will work, so that's my first point, and then I'll just say my scale factor is 0.0833. Sometimes I like to do a 0.1 and then a 0.833 for floating point accuracy issues. So it's going to take a second. Line work is always really heavy, so just be sure you clean that stuff up before you render or do anything else. 20,000 or 200,000 lines is not fun to try to make 2D on if it's embedded in your 3D models, things like that. So let's move this, and I'll snap from, just to check to make sure I guess the right scale factor. So I'm going to go from there and move it back to our college architecture 3D mesh model here. And you can see there's a, well, we call it low poly. We reduce the level of detail. There's also, the CAD files are sort of a gathering of 10, 15 years of CAD files done by different people, so not everything fits. Our 3D models were generated from LiDAR, which you guys have seen in the past. It's a laser scan. So all the little 1 or 2 foot distances there can be either a bad drawing or a bad interpretation of the LiDAR. It depends. So you just gotta kind of realize there's a fault tolerance on all these models. So these 2 objects are to scale. I just wanted to make sure that was the case so we can kind of get an idea of our boundary and which buildings are getting cut off and how they're getting cut off. If you are terribly afraid of 3D Studio Max and you want to do editing in Rhino, feel free, but mesh editing is not exactly the funnest thing to do in Rhino. It's much easier to do in 3D Studio Max. It's designed to deal with meshes, whereas Rhino's designed to deal with the NURBs. So you've got a couple of fill holes. I'd try those. I think we noticed earlier that some of these things were generating extra vertices for no reason. So I'm going to pop back to 3D Studio Max and give a quick overview of how to clean these up in Max and just take a look at them. So one thing I do like to change, I think by default this is set to realistic. The perspective view, I like to keep everything in wireframe. It's much faster. And if I have to toggle a different mode other than wireframe, use it only in perspective, it only really makes sense there. So if you right click on this, you can have a bunch of different options. Like I said, realistic is usually default checked. If I switch that back, you can see it's trying to do lighting. It's going to slow things down for really no apparent gain. So I also like to turn on edge faces here, but go ahead and put it on the hidden line, and it should respond a bit faster in general, especially over VLab. It's doing a little bit of ambient occlusion. So basically what you're going to do, and I would work at a 1:1 scale. If you scale this down to a 64th of an inch equals a foot, it's going to be really difficult because your tolerances of the 3D models distances are very difficult to work with. Same with the viewport clipping. It will clip out. You won't be able to see the whole model. So clean these things up 1:1. So I'm just clicking on these, the basic movements. If you middle mouse click, it'll pan in the viewports. Just click down on the middle mouse and then move while you're holding it. If you hold the Alt key down and middle mouse and click and move, it will rotate. And if you hit Z, it'll select or zoom to a selected object. So you can roll the mouse and zoom out, select an object, hit Z, hold Alt down, which is right below it, middle mouse click, and view around the 3D model. There's a lot of right click. If you right click on anything, it's got context sensitive menus. You move, rotate, scale, select subobject modes here, which are reflected over here in the edit mesh window as well. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Those are keyboard shortcuts, number keyboard shortcuts to the top of the keyboard that go across that you can jump into, or you can switch in the right click menu. So these are what you're going to have to clean up. So there's a lot of instances of 3D models in this that will be one building, sustainable education, and it's connected by a bridge to a Mason building, things like that. So you're going to have to attach these buildings if you want to cap these properly. And you can hold Control down to add to selection. So I've got one selected, I'm going to hold Control and click on the other one. And then if you hit Alt Q, it will isolate that selection. So you're just working with that one piece of geometry, or those two pieces of geometry. So if we wanted to cap this to make it ready for a 3D model, it should be fairly easy. We just got to make sure there's a hole punched, which if there is a connection, there should be. You can see there's that hole punched in the bridge on both sides. So we should be able to select one of these objects and attach under the Modify tab here. If it's on Create, just switch it over to Modify. And hit Attach button. It turns blue when it's active, and it'll just sit there and wait until you either right-click or click on that button again to get out of that mode. So now it's attached. What we need to do now is go into the Vertex Mode and select all the vertices. Control-A will do that. And weld them. I've got a 6-inch threshold because I'm at 1 unit equals 1 foot. A lot of our details aren't at that smaller resolution, under a foot, to cause any issues. You can see that pivot point jumped when I weld it. And you can also, and I'm undoing this real quick, there's 169 vertices, there was 173, so that number seems about right to add 2 rings of 4 vertices and make sure they're connected. Alright, so once I do that, I'm in the subobject vertex mode. I can switch to edge mode and tell the 3D model. And if you hover in gray space or you grab this sidebar here, you can scroll up and down in these menus. They're pretty long and involved, a lot of different options. So the first thing I want to do is figure out if I have any open edges in edge mode. So you got a couple ways you can get into edge mode, toggle in and out, and I can pan the window down and say select open edges. Now it's kind of like the naked edges in Rhino, and you can see I've got a pretty good set. It's that bottom set of open edges are the only ones I need to cap this thing. So I should be able to use the cap holes command, and that will usually do a good job of just capping it, and I should be ready to go. At that point, it does look like it did something funky there. So let me just double check. I'm going to put quick edit mesh on here and select everything. It looks alright. So it did a 1-to-1 kind of attachment. I don't know why that vertex is there. But that should be fine. And if I get out of subobject mode and put a STL check modifier, on this and tell it to check. It should say no errors, which it does. And I'll need this too. So we've got cap holes there. It worked. Hit Alt, or right click and say unhide all. We'll get rid of my isolated selection. And then I can kind of move through and do that to any other object. So this one is a building by itself. It doesn't need to be attached. I can hit Alt Q again. You might run into some issues here where you've got a slope or it's not a planar situation or there's something odd. So just take a look. I'll go ahead and try cap holes on this one and see what we get. It looks like it did an alright job there as well. So what you're looking for is to run this command. If you run into any issues, you're going to have to maybe clean things up at a vertex level, but this should get you 90% of the way through all the models. I think the only ones that we noticed a issue with the other day was these two and Clough, which needed some geometry added to it. I think I already did both of those. So if you run into an issue where it's not capping properly, it most likely has to do with it will not cap some kind of a stepped piece of geometry like this, or it will not cap a flat surface on the bottom and a side surface here. So you'd either have to add the library to this. If it doesn't have a hole punched into it, you probably need to rebuild some faces in here. There's a bunch of ways to do that. Probably the simplest way is just to do the create face or polygon mode, and that's what snaps on. You want to turn on snap here. If you right click on this, it'll give you all your options like you have in V-Ray. Vertex, I think turn off grid points if that's on by default, and just turn on vertex. It should be all you need. And then you can hit S or click on this button to toggle snaps on and off. So I'm just going to click vertex to vertex. You need to be really careful. This won't let you continue a command like in Rhino, so I'm going to maximize this viewport down here in the bottom. Right, and you can see I need to build a little teeny triangle here. So I'm going to click 1, 2, 3, and then kind of double click on that last one to complete it. And then I'll need to do a triangle. So you need to create a triangle for every part here that's missing if you want to close this off. And then you'll have a big one here as you go across those. And if you mess it up, you can just hit escape and it might jump back to the last one that you did right. And like I said, you just need to make sure you're in the create. It turns blue and it's an active command. And make sure you're snapping to the right location. And you can always run an STL check after you try to close that up. So that piece is closed up there just by creating edges. What I need to do probably here, because I don't think it'll cap properly, is probably snap this vertex down. I'm going to right click and hit move. If I hit Control and Shift, I turn off that transform gizmo, which sometimes messes up your snapping because you're constraining to an axis. This is like the gumball and Rhino, where I can constrain it to that axis, or that plane, this axis, Y or X, by clicking and holding in that area, and it should highlight when you get planar constraints as well. So that can sometimes mess up your snapping. I'm going to turn that off and turn snap on, and just click, hold, drag, and it'll snap down to that vertex. And then I can weld that out. Control A, weld everything, and then let's see what happens with the cap holes on this building now. Okay, so that did a pretty decent job. There's probably some funkiness. If you right click, you're sort of seeing a reduced visual representation of the actual mesh. I think you saw all the triangles in Rhino, and you can kind of have primary and secondary kind of visuals. If you right click on these objects, by default they're kind of turned off, but you can turn them on and off one at a time. Just uncheck this edges only, hit OK, and it will show you the other topologies on there. So something like that's going to print kind of weird. It's got this like fold to it, so you can do things afterwards. You can put an edit mesh modifier on top of that cap holes, go into edge mode, and you can turn these edges and this will just turn the direction that they're triangulated in. So we have kind of a rule in our lab to kind of use the shortest distance. And you can see actually it did something really strange right there. That's bad. So that's not going to come through. And that's probably another issue. So let me see. I can try a few things like just selecting the faces to see what's going on there. Yeah, it does look like there's a face there. I might be able to just turn an edge and get away with that one. Yeah, so turn a few more here, and this will give me a lot nicer kind of ramped progression rather than a bunch of edges turned on each other. You can do things if you're missing, let's say you had a vertex on this face but not one on this face. Let me delete that and I'll create it real quick. So I'm just going to divide that face and add another vertex in there. And then I'll recreate the one that I deleted so that we can simulate the problem here. So I'm just clicking 3 times, and you can see you need to make sure everything's kind of got a 1-to-1. So there's a vertex coming off of this vertex into this edge here, but there's no corresponding edge coming from here or from here to match that vertex. So that is in a sense an open edge and doesn't pass STL. It'll probably still print alright, but it won't pass STL. So I'll just show you, like, if I pull that vertex up, it's a gaping hole. So a lot of times what you want to do is maybe try to divide that edge, but it's kind of hard to pick the right one. Sometimes you end up dividing this one again. So you can select a face and tell it to tessellate the face center, and it'll actually add a vertex in the middle. And then what I usually do is delete that face there, go into Vertex Mode, and snap and move that extra vertex there and weld it, and it should pass STL after that. So that's the basic kind of maneuvers you need to do in an edit mesh modifier. There's a bunch of other ones. There's things where you can kind of select an edge. If you got a missing hole, let's say here, you can do things like select the edge and extrude it. So sometimes extrusions get a little crazy. So you can see I'm just dragging that spinner and moving it down. Sometimes I like to go further than I need to go so that I can precisely move and snap that back. And then a lot of times, if it's not totally planar, which this is the case here, you can kind of see there's a little bit of a gap there. You need to select that vertex and snap it in there. Select everything and weld it, and you should be good to go. If there's any one-off issues, if these get assigned out, you can deal with them. Go ahead and try to cap all of them, see if they pass STL check. And if they don't, and none of the strategies I've shown you here, you can email me and tell me which building name. You can just copy it out of here. In the modify panel, you can copy that text, paste it, and I'll know which building to take a look at. But just make sure everything's to scale. You don't work at a 64th inch in Rhino or in 3D Studio Max because it's very difficult, and then scale things down afterwards, maybe once you import them in to Rhino and match up with everything else. Alright, thanks.